various topics like culture, history, politics, and science. Supriya was previously the books columnist of Mumbai Mirror and editor at the Caravan magazine. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and Vogue. Ms. Supriya Nair, thank you so much for coming here to be with us. It's a real honor to have you here.
The honor is all mine. Thank you.
So I'd first like to start off with saying how much I am a fan of 52.in. One of our professors introduced it to us when I think we were in first or second year. And I think one of the first articles I read was Rice, Fat, Meat, and Streets. And I completely loved the article itself, the essay itself, what it was doing with words, with the narrative of speaking about biryani in Karachi. But what I found really impressive with it was that there was a space that allowed such kind of writing to come out. And there was a space that encouraged and cultivated that kind of writing as well. So what I'd first like to ask you is your journey with long form. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got into it and what long form writing has done to and for you?
Yes. First of all, thank you for the question, and thank you for the very generous introduction. Thank you also to you and everyone else who named this session "Longing for Form," which I found hilarious and ironic, and which echoed a little bit of my own distrust of the word long form, or at least the shorthand of it. Which is not to tell you, Yasmin, that I don't like it or that I don't think you should be using it. It means something to a lot of people, and it's a serious word. But one of the things that I have learned over the years of reading and editing narrative journalism, something that you're involved in as well, and something that you're a student of, is that what you're looking for is depth, right, to a story. And so the length of the story kind of becomes a byproduct of it. So we describe it as long format because, I mean, that's kind of, it's a holdover from print, right? Like print is quick, print is stuff that fits into a page, and long format stuff is exceptional because it's unbound by the constraints of how much place there is to set type. So I just wanted to put that out there up front. I would really love it if more people thought of narrative journalism as something where, which is not like which isn't defined by its length, but is rather something that is identifiable by the depth into which it goes into its subject, and its ability to immerse you in a story, in a narrative. And maybe later in the conversation we can talk about what sets that apart from other kinds of journalism that runs long, so to speak. I began life as a journalist in kind of in maybe the last golden days, as they say, of The Sound of Music in Austria in 1939. In the last golden days of print journalism, I had the very good fortune of working for a really lovely fashion magazine as part of my first job, a fashion and lifestyle magazine in Bombay called Verve, who's still around, who still do very good work. After which I worked for the weekend magazine Mint Lounge. And I then moved to the Caravan magazine, which, as you know, has been a practitioner of brilliant narrative and investigative journalism that really does run long, that really does go in depth, often in encyclopedic depth about the subjects that it covers for well over a decade now. And I was there between 2013 and 16. And my career since has kind of been, a little bit about editing and a little bit about writing and trying to balance out the two. My own writing has all kind of been shorter format work, which I've really enjoyed. I write columns and features and do interviews and profiles. And but when my co-founders and I at All Things Small, which is this media startup that we run, were putting we were trying to decide what goes into, okay, what are the exciting things that we're going to do. One of the things that naturally excited all of us was the idea of a project where you could just let reporters and writers and essayists tell their stories without constraints. This was always going to be a digital-only publication, so we did not have to worry about the single thing that has traditionally worried journalists all along, which is how are you going to pay for ink, how are you going to pay for paper, how are you going to pay for distribution. When you don't have to worry about all of that, you can just you can be unconstrained, not totally unconstrained, of course, because the one thing that we ask, my editorial team and I, my colleagues, we ask each other every time a draft comes in is, how long does this need to be? And so it's not really about about letting a writer run amok or an editor run amok, but it is about giving a story as much space as it needs to be told.
Okay. And that's something that happens in multiple dimensions across both 52.in and all things small. The idea of giving space for people to explore a story is there in all of the essays that are there in 52.in. There's so much engagement with the story that comes out from the journalist's commitment to whatever story they're pursuing, and the ability to details and have room for those details as well. There's another thing that 52.in does really nicely, which is allowing people to take up space in different spheres. So you have essays that are there on culture, there are essays on history, there's essays on politics, there's essays on, like wildlife and about science and meteorology. Some of the recent essays have also focused on artificial intelligence. So I'd like to ask if you could tell us a little bit about the nature of the journalism that you're trying to cultivate in 52.in. You've already touched upon it a little bit, but if you could tell us about how you locate writers and also personally how you pick the stories that you'd like to work on to edit.
There are many parts to that question, so I'll try and answer it in part so as not to kind of run over time, because I want to hear from you as well. It's something that I presume all the journalism students over here are familiar with, is just the conversation that you have with newsrooms when it comes to two things. One, you pitch them stories, ideas that you want to publish with their outlet, and they accept it if it works. And the second thing is editors writing to you saying, hey, I know you're a writer who works on X subject. I'm looking for a story in this category. Can you work on it for us? So there's pitching and then there's briefs, right? Both of those we're very active with on 52. There's kind of a history to how 52 started publishing the essays that it did, and I'll try and tell it to you in no more than 5 sentences. We commissioned a first draft of writers to go out and do really adventurous, kind of reporting over weeks and months to bring us stories from various corners of the country. And none of those ended up working out because a couple of months into when we started commissioning, the pandemic hit and we went into lockdown. So we had to redesign our ideas of what would go into the magazine. And that involved going back to these writers and saying, what is the story that you would like to tell? That constrained by the fact that you can't leave your desk. And so our first stories were all written like that. Well into the second season of 52, writers were working on the essays that emerged from there. So 52's focus on history, on kind of the longue durée, which is what historians call the long term, just because it's like French, really emerged out of that, which was if you can't travel in space, how deeply can you travel in time? And one of the things that we asked our writers, which is something I learned from my time at the Caravan, was if you had to tell a story that would be read not just over the week it comes out or the month it comes out, but a year or 2 years or 5 years later? What is that story? What would you choose to tell? The other thing that we could offer that was unique to 52, or at least rare among other Indian publications, was simply time and to some extent resources. So we said, look, I can give you a year if you want to report a story. I just need to know where in my calendar it's going to fall. So if you had a year, which presumably another publication that works on a faster schedule can't give you, what is the story you're passionate about and what would you choose to tell? That is how all the stories that you see on 52 came about. The mix of subjects is really a reflection of our tastes and interests and some sense of what we think will like land in the long term, right? That question that I spoke about earlier, which is, if I come back to this in 5 years, is it still going to be interesting to me? All magazines, I think, are ultimately a reflection of the people who work in them. And in that sense, we're no different from that. You brought up wildlife. I'm glad you've enjoyed those stories. I have absolutely nothing to do with them. I can barely tell a tree apart from a dog. This is entirely down to, for example, my colleague, Vikram Shah, who is a wildlife enthusiast. So that's just like one of the ways in which 52 happens to have the mix of subjects it does.
Okay. And how do you locate the writers that would be passionate about working on various stories? Do you invite them, or do you look for people in particular?
Yeah, one of the things that happens when you've spent a while in the media is simply getting to know other people. So to some extent, there is a network effect. Many of the first writers I reached out to were people whom I'd worked with before or whose work I'd read and who I was familiar with and who responded to me because they were familiar with my work, right? Beyond that, finding new writers very heavily depends on writers pitching us. And we don't really have any rules in place about your age or your experience or anything of the sort. If we like the idea and if we feel like we can work together successfully on a story, we are happy to engage with you for as long as it takes to ensure that we have like the perfect overlap between what we want and what we want to write.
You've told us a lot about the kind of writing that comes out in 52 Opinion. You've also said that you've mentioned the engagement that it kind of allows. I want to know what your thoughts are on narrative journalism as a way of introducing people to certain subjects or certain spheres that they otherwise might not have been involved in or wouldn't have been exposed to in the daily journalism part of it, where in the newspaper, like you said, everything is compressed, you're worried about the cost of ink and so on. So there's only so much that the newspaper can do, the daily print publication can do. Do you think narrative journalism creates that kind of space, and something like 52 would kind of offer a nice little introduction of like, okay, here's something you can check out, and it's a long read and you might get into it, but even if it's not a long read, it gives you a certain like immersion.
That's right. I think you've identified something that, again, maybe this is something you talk about a lot in journalism, but it's a pretty fundamental difference, I think, between the service that newspapers do for their readers versus the service that magazines do. One of the things I talk about a lot with my colleagues in Indian journalism is the fact that you cannot read today's Indian newspaper if you have not read yesterday's, right? That's a bit of an exaggeration, but if you look at tomorrow's paper when you get it, and if you just defamiliarize yourself from the language, you'll see how much of it is really so dense with context and how alien that would be to someone who just stepped off a plane and picked it up. A magazine's job is to introduce you to things, right? Starting from its base commercial impulse, which was to introduce you to products that you might want to buy. Which when it started over 100 or 200 years ago. in the format that we know it now. That's and I think that's a really good impulse. Hey, here's something you don't know you're interested in. Here's something that's not necessary to your life. It's not like the newspaper which is telling you about like sewage issues in your neighborhood and conflicts in your government and a war on your continent. It's maybe you don't need to know about. Let me think about maybe you don't need to know about homelessness in New York. And yet when you read, when you open the New Yorker and you see someone having written about it, you give it a chance, and then they carry you along simply on the power of that immersion, on the power of that story. The work that they have done, that the writer has done over weeks and months, sometimes years, is to familiarize themselves really intensely with this subject, right? And the story is an act of translation in which they allow you to believe for the duration of that essay that you will come away having read that story, having experienced that story with the same kind of familiarity. That is the trick that magazine journalism plays on you. I think it's a very good trick. It's a very important trick. The side effect, of course, is annoying because then, someone who's read like one issue of the New Yorker will never shut up about it. But yeah, that's fine. That is one of the purposes of what magazine journalism broadly does, and that is definitely one of the purposes of narrative journalism, which is to hold someone's hand and explain to them something very, very particular, and through that explanation, make an argument for why it's universal.
Okay. That's really interesting, and there's a really nice tenderness in allowing narrative journalism to play that role of saying
Yes.
that you don't have to have like 20 years of context for this because we'll tell you what this is about. You needn't have read the paper.
And it's a service, right? Like I said, I think there's a lot of prestige attached to narrative journalism, as much prestige as can ever be attached to a fundamentally disreputable profession like journalism. But it is, I think one of the things that you cannot afford to forget when you practice journalism and magazine journalism, which you can afford to forget, I think, if you are writing literature. Correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have other arguments about this, this is a service to a reader. This is a service that you are providing to a reader. You are telling them what to think about and what to care about. And so the tenderness that you talk about, Yasmin, I think is pretty fundamental to that. It comes from a place of great compassion and humility.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could say in a sense that the conventional news values of urgency and familiarity and relevance of the news is something that's it's not overlooked or superseded by narrative journalism, but it's not placed at the absolute center. So like you said, narrative journalism essays, you could return to them in 5 years or 10 years, and it would still be the same good piece of writing that it remained. It wouldn't lose any of its value.
Having said which, sorry, just to interject, I do think that one of the tricks that we play is the hook, right? This is something you will find in every weekend magazine around the world. Why am I telling you this story now? And that doesn't change even if it's something like 52, which has the luxury of being unmoored from the news cycle. I have to make an argument to you on the day my story drops about why you should care about this now. And that could be a subtle one, or it could be, an unsubtle one. An unsubtle example is how often weekend magazines do anniversary issues, right?
Yeah.
So that's one way to do it. But also, it could take on a lot of different contexts.
Yeah. When you said about the hook, about why am I giving you the story now, I was reminded there's this essay on 52 about platonic relationships and friendships, and that dropped on February 14th.
That's right.
So that was very punchy.
Yeah. Thank you for appreciating that.
It's very nice that there's a little bit of subversion that happens in some magazines that kind of allow both the reader and the editor and the journalist to explore something that perhaps everybody else is taking different. And this is a little bit like, okay, everybody else is giving you Valentine's Day ads and 50% off on Cadbury chocolate or whatever, but you should read about friendships. Why not think about that?
Right. Please invest in your friends. Says says Prachi Pingle, a fantastic. Sorry, can I take a minute to talk about that story?
Please.
Prachi got in touch with us maybe a couple of years ago. Prachi's a teacher of journalism herself in Bangalore, by the way. So if your paths might cross at some point, and you should say hi to her. She's really great. She's like a field reporter through and through. And we started off by talking about a completely different story. She'd been researching agriculture in Maharashtra. She wanted to write a story about that. And as we were talking about it, she mentioned this offhand and said, "This is something I've been thinking about all the time. I'd love to write about it, but I don't know how to start." And I can see the problem. I feel like one of the things we lack in the Indian landscape is space for great personal essay writing and great models for essay writing that touches on the personal. We have in the Zoom room with us, I think one of the most wonderful practitioners of the form, which is Vijeta Kumar, whose work I really love. But in Prachi's case, to come back to her, she didn't have experience doing this, and I do think it takes experience. It takes a lot of practice to write about yourself, right? And it as journalism students, the writing something confessional or revealing a secret about yourself seems like an easy thing to do, and it seems like it reap rich rewards. But when you actually start writing such a thing, you realize how much you have to unblock yourself to do that. Yeah. I think with Prachi, one of the things that I was excited about was here was someone who had already solved in some ways the hardest thing about journalism, which is just going out and talking to people, right? That's like you have to forget yourself in just how relentless you have to be in pursuing people and in asking them questions and in getting them to trust you and tell you about the things you want to know that you have no business knowing about. And Prachi already has years of experience doing that. And I said, look, you've spent years chasing farmers in interior Maharashtra to talk about the thing that you're obsessed with talking about. Think of it like that. Like, talk to your own friends about your friendships. Let's see what comes out of it. And then sit down and we'll work on writing and rewriting that story. And so, I admire Prachi so much for giving it a shot. And for writing like an emotionally honest story, but also for approaching it like a reported piece, which is what she did, and whose end result. So,
speaking of Vijay ma'am, she's always told us about Joan Didion and the way that she writes, about writing about intensely personal things, the way that somebody would report on some event, and writing about events like elections, the way that somebody would write a personal essay. So this is probably another example of that. I'd like to come back to this idea of the personal essay and how to start, and the kind of skills that the field reportage contributes to the way that you write as well. But first, if I may, I'd like to pull some threads together from 52 and what you said about journalism having to do this. Not having to do, but being a profession and discipline that performs this act of service. Ultimately, your reader is somebody who must be out of what you've written. They must be more informed, or they must kind of be something must happen. Something must happen in different ways. It could be like you read a piece of journalism, you read a narrative journalism essay, and you become familiar with an experience that actually isn't your own, like about homelessness in New York, or you're consoled by what has been written, or you're informed, and therefore you have a response to it. So there's many essays that kind of might provoke this kind of response or intrigue a certain kind of curiosity. One of those essays for me was this one about meteorological models that are being evolved in India, and how
Mm.
that might be able to predict weather more accurately and thus save people's lives and their livelihoods. And that's something that has that aspect of relevance to it, because it is a problem that India faces. Extreme climate events are disrupting agriculture in ways that we don't personally know about, but we know vaguely, tangentially, that it's happening. So related to our question of narrative journalism introducing people to things that they might otherwise not get involved in, I'd really like to know your thoughts on how this thing of journalism as a service to people, and the idea of narrative journalism doing this deeper engagement kind of combines together. And what does that combination do for the future of narrative journalism in India? Do you think there's a new landscape that can be created, or is it already being created?
I think the landscape of journalism in India is subject to factors that uh, don't have a lot to do with the talent or the creativity in the field today. This is also true widely of many industries in India. They're shaped by political and social factors that go way beyond uh,
Yeah.
the ability of one community to kind of reflect or react. And for me personally, the way that uh, the digital revolution, to give it its most flattering uh, description, has interacted with politics and society in India, is really crucial to how the future of journalism itself plays out, right? The one thing that I think journalism has going for it is that it is really an essential product. And despite the disaggregation of relevance and the fracturing of attention, the need for it doesn't go away. The fact that some of India's biggest cities don't have papers today that you can pick up in the morning that will tell you about what your municipality is doing and what the water situation in your neighborhood is, and uh, what the RWA aunties are pushing for in your dystopian surveillance-driven future are up to, is like a problem. But that doesn't mean that you don't need it, right? So there is a case to be made that all of these this essential service that you perform has to survive, and that um, while it may disappear from the landscape for a bit, as long as people have the ability to engage with it, and they have the ability to, and some of them have the ability to pay for it or to support it, it's always going to be around. What does that mean for narrative journalism in particular? I don't know. Is it essential to the functioning of a society, of a democracy, of a community? Yes, I really think it does, because I really think memory and record keeping and stories that we can repeat to each other are all really important things for our functioning as a society. They're crucial to our okay, maybe I'm exaggerating by saying that they're crucial to our survival, but they're pretty helpful to our survival, right? Uh, the question is, how do you recenter its relevance? How do you get people to pay attention to it? And strangely enough, I think the durability of narrative journalism is the answer. That someone who One of the things we thought about when we were shaping 52 was how can we how can we present our work in the most non-intimidating way possible to a young person who hasn't really been familiarized with reading, who doesn't think of themselves as a reader. And there's only so much I can do in that sense, right? I don't want to go out and grab someone by their collar and say, hey, stop looking at these reels and read this 5,000 word story instead. But the work is there, and we have tried to write it. We've tried to make sure that our style is accessible and approachable, and that the stories look fresh, and that they will feel fresh, so that when you are looking for, maybe a story uh, about a woman that you saw on Rocket Boys, who happens to be who happens to be Vikram Sarabhai's mistress, but who also happens to be this, actually an extraordinary person with her own identity and her career besides Vikram Sarabhai. Maybe what you do is you look up Kamla Chaudhary, and you see Chinmay Tumbe's wonderful essay about her, which was published early on in 52. And you come away feeling like, okay, I didn't have to buy a book to discover more about this woman. I didn't have to go to a library to do it. These are all good things, and maybe I will do it. But for now, someone explained her life and her work and just her extraordinary accomplishments to me in a way that made me feel like it was written for me. And I think if we do that, that's like a good service to be provided. Sorry, did I get it answering and addressing your question, or did I kind of go all over the place?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there is a lot of ambiguity about the future of journalism, and
yeah.
I mean,
okay. Let me put it this way. I think there is ambiguity about the future of journalists as they practice their work now.
Yeah.
Because the point isn't that nobody needs you talking about municipal elections and water and sewage and wars and film reviews and stuff like that, right? It's that the platforms where someone can access these and engage with them are running the risk of seeming irrelevant in the face of gigantic movements in technology that go beyond anything that you or me or the 50 people in this room can do. So this problem is something that faces not just journalists, but workers in a lot of industries. And I think as the fate of workers in our society goes, so the fate of journalists and editors goes too.
I just have one final maybe question before turning it over to the audience to see if they have any questions. Sorry, could you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I think I lost you for about 30 seconds.
Okay, now.
Yeah, we're a bit on and off, but.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, hold on. Let me try and go off video for a minute. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Yes. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll come back in 5 minutes.
I just have one last question for you before turning it over to the audience for their questions. It's perhaps a question that's related to like many of the things that we spoke about, but also were kind of implied in our conversation. Two things which you spoke about are really important to not just narrative journalism, but also any kind of journalism in particular. One is this idea of durability. And the other is this idea of memory and record keeping and telling stories to each other that even if are not crucial for our survival, could be said to be crucial for our growth as a society. So journalists, like you said, there's a lot of ambiguity about their positions because they're subjected to a lot of external pressures, which, we as individuals might not be able to do anything about. But there's this notion that journalism gains its support from readers who might want to read the kind of stories that are being put out, which journalists also want to invest their time and energy into. And all of the essays that show up on 52.in are labors of love in a sense. They're works that people invest months and hours of research and field work and months of just going around following the story and different things. And then, they spend a lot of time working out how to convey that story to the readers without making them disinterested. So if narrative journalism acts as this kind of vehicle for stories that deserve to be told, that also the reader deserves to hear or read, then perhaps daily journalism acts as a vehicle for a kind of conscientization, which allows the reader to become informed about their everyday society, or maybe allows them to think about their everyday society a little bit more. So what I'd like to ask, which perhaps Prachi also utilized in her essay, was that cross mingling of these skills of, we're using daily journalism skills, we're using interviews, we're using the idea of field work, but we're also extending that into these longer essays. And the reason I'm asking about skills and the kind of maybe like a little toolkit that a narrative journalist would require is because many of us, both in this meeting and in college, we struggle a lot with doing narrative journalism, or with doing long form writing of any kind, because we don't know, like, what are we supposed to do? How do we do this essay? So is there anything that you have drawn out of your years of experience of working with these longer forms of essay writing and with 52 and all things small that you could tell us would kind of aid in writing?
I'll do my best. The luxury that you get when you are working on a long format magazine story, which you don't get when you're working on a reported story for a daily or just a kind of quicker, shorter format work, is time. And the thing you have to use that time to do are two things. One is to report more, which is, you now have the time to interview. You now have the time to interview 8 people instead of 4 people, or you have the time to interview one person for 4 days instead of for 1 day.
Mm.
You have to use that well, and there is no substitute to that, right? The second thing that time gives you is the time to rewrite your story. And I hope the most helpful thing that I can say to you, like in terms of immediate relief, is I have not met a single writer, okay, maybe like one, but I'm not going to take their name because it will like inflate their head a little too much. I have not met a single writer who gets it right in the first draft. And for me as an editor, it is difficult to impossible to crack to see a perfect final draft on the first draft either. The only thing that is possible for us to do after the first draft comes in, and of course in the run up to the first draft, where the reporter and the editors are kind of discussing, their ideas about what they think the story is going to end up being, to ensure that they're on the same page. The only thing you can do after that is to ask as many questions as possible, experiment and see. You've chosen this structure for your first draft because you wanted to get all the facts in. Would this structure instead be better as a way to tell the story and to make sure that time passes in a way that that compels the reader to go from start to finish, right? And once you do that, I feel like it is very rare for any story on 52 not to be rewritten at least thrice, at a minimum. And I feel like the only thing to remember is that if you spend enough time on that document, and it's, I'm sorry, it's very unromantic, it's a slog. You rewrite it. If it looks good to you, like rewrite it again. And the third time, maybe you're at a place where you feel like this is something that can last. And this is something where everything that you have learned about the subject that is now intensely familiar to you has now been presented in a way that it can become familiar to someone who knows nothing about it.
Right. Yeah, that's a
Sorry.
perfect answer.
Is that not simple? I don't know if you have the time to. I don't know if I feel like one of the things that journalism students are always short on is time. I don't know if you can spend 2 months working on a single story. Is that something you guys can do?
We can actually, because we have portfolios that are to be submitted at the end of our semester, and we get our portfolio requirements like at least like a couple of months in advance. So we can take the time to pursue a story for that period of time. I mean, I don't know if we can get as many hours, but we definitely.
Yeah, I know that's difficult. And maybe one of the things, I don't know how helpful this is for every journalism student, but one of the other things that Joan Didion did, I believe, was to just type out stories by Ernest Hemingway on her typewriter by hand, so that she could internalize his style, and so that it could become a form of muscle memory for her, because she wanted to write like him. And I think maybe if you'll share your drafts and you'll are able to like edit each other, and I don't know, like rewrite someone else's story 3 times. It may perhaps be, if you have the time and the interest to do that only, it may be one way to figure out an editorial style for yourself.
That's a really good idea. I think I'm going to torment my classmates about this in coming weeks. That's the end of my questions. I'll now ask the audience if they have any questions. Please put your question in the chat box, and Ms. Supriya will be able to see and answer them. Okay, Shweta Philip.
Hi, Shweta Philip. Do you ever find yourself getting tired of your writing or your voice? How to keep writing? Yeah, I mean, it's frequent, like I'm frequently embarrassed by what I write, and I still don't know if I have a single voice. I didn't study writing, and so a lot of what I did in my early 20s was to mimic writers I liked for my private writing. I mean, not in journalism. Where of course the ask is different. So I still don't know if I have a single voice, or if the voice I write in now is the voice that I will continue to write in 5 years from now. I think being open to just not being an unromantic, practical kind of writer who writes to suit the need of the story and the hour and the audience has its good points that way. If you tell yourself that if you stop telling yourself I'm a writer and you tell yourself I have to write, I feel like the tiredness kind of becomes a bit irrelevant. One of the things I should say, sorry, I don't want to go on and on. One of the things I should say that journalism frees you from is this constraint of my writing, my voice, my thing. I know a lot of journalists who think like that, and I've never had the opportunity to tell them this. But I think that's I don't think that's the most practical way to go about what you do. Journalism is very much a collaborative process. That is why you have editors. That is why you have a desk, and they're there to help you. They're there to help you get it out. So in that sense, it's a great joy. It's a tremendous joy to be able to collaborate with a good copy desk and with good editors. Highly recommended.
Okay. Do we have more questions, Ms. Priya? Okay, in the interim, I want to ask you if you can tell us about some of your favorite stories that you worked on as an editor at 52.
No, how can I tell you that? All the stories are my favorite. If you have questions about a particular story, I'm happy to answer them if I have interesting stories to tell you. But it is not possible for me to pick favorites, and I'm not going to play that game. However, I will tell you brought up the meteorological story, and by virtue of this Zoom conversation, by virtue of my being on the Zoom conversation, I have no compunction in revealing to y'all. You will be the first to know that Colin Daileda, the excellent writer of that story, is writing our next story on Saturday. It is about climate. It is about climate change, and it is about life in India under the shadow of our looming environmental future. He's based in Bangalore. He's just a wonderful writer. I can't recommend his work highly enough, and I hope you will read and enjoy his work. Maybe he'd be a good person to chat to or to write to if you have questions about narrative journalism.
That would be quite fantastic. Maybe next year we can also have him here with us.
Yeah, that'd be great. That's true, and he won't even. He lives. Okay, he lives in a prominent Bangalore neighborhood, so he can Uber it over. Okay, Karthik Nagendra has asked, while writing a long form, how can one balance between how deep the story must go versus how long and readable a piece must be? Yes, very important balance to strike. One that I don't necessarily feel like I'm able to get right 100% of the time. But I think, again, one of the things that editors do is to form a bridge between the writer and the reader. Very often conscientious journalists, and even conscientious journalists and journalists who, who take pride in their style, which is a good and very important thing to do, kind of tend to want to lay it all out on the table, right? Everything I've learned, I want to put in the story. Every beautiful sentence that I'm able to write, I wish to enchant the reader with it. And it is an editor's job to say yes, in theory. However, on a Saturday morning, when the story goes out, we think that this is about the depth to which a reader will engage with your work. And so can we shape it in a way that the most important and urgent and necessary and beautiful things about the story can go out, in a way that serves the reader and their attention and their time. This is a give and take. You never want to be the kind of editor who's who's just there to shill totally on behalf of the reader, right? That's not the thing. I mean, sure, then nobody needs to read a story. They can all just watch a TikTok instead. But that's not it. You have to so I think finding that constant balance is something that, to cut a long story short, if a writer engages with a reader, whether that reader is an editor or simply someone who is familiar with their work and whom they can trust to give them good advice, that will help them find the balance. And it is a better way to find balance than making all your decisions on your own. I hope that was satisfactory. Samya K asks, how to be a decent editor when you're also insecure about your own writing? I mean, editing is a job, right? You have to be fair to the writer whose work you're working with. You are providing them a service and you are providing your readers a service. So it's entirely separate from how you feel about your own writing or what you want to write. One of the things that solves this problem for editors and has solved it for editors for over a century has just been the newsroom style book, right? So the desk will tell a reporter, hey, it's not me, this is our style. Institutionalizing style is a great way to get around the problem of, you're a good writer, but I think this sentence should be written like this. In publishing, that works differently, right? An editor must have some confidence in their own ability to understand and bring out voice in order to polish the writer's work. And I mean, the only way to do that, honestly, is to practice a lot, to work very hard, and to read a lot. I've never heard of an editor who has said or believed that that reading is a waste of time, because it really isn't. It really is an editor's university. When will 52.in be back after the coming hiatus? Asks Abhishek K. Abhishek, we will let you know as soon as we have figured this out for ourselves. We'd like to do some deep rethink. The first 2 seasons of 52, which we have loved and which we cherish, were also very much products of these very crisis-ridden years, right? Of lockdowns and Delta waves and so on and so forth. And now that hopefully we are past that, we really want to step back and see, okay, we've done this, what else can we do? And work accordingly. So give us a little bit of time to figure that out. SJC English asks, you've created podcasts also. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of scripting and working on these? I can't actually, because I haven't written a podcast script. I've only ever appeared on podcasts as a conversationalist or an interviewer/interviewee. My colleagues have worked on some of these podcasts. It is somewhat different. I think the one thing that podcasters get right, or good podcasters get right, is that they have to read, is the sense of time that they have, right? Because you have to read out your work, you have to read out the sentences, you have to make sure that the rhythm is right, and you have to make sure that it fits a time frame. And I think that is such a useful skill that is such a useful habit for writers to develop anyway. Lots of writers, lots of novelists do this, as you know. They read out their own work so that they're able to listen to it and edit accordingly. Sorry for that completely vague, off the rails kind of answer, but that's about all I'm capable of telling. And 21JIP100 Tanishq asks, how do you balance the need for in-depth research and reporting with the demands of tight deadlines in the fast-paced news cycle? I don't. 52 has a calendar. This is true of, I think, most publications that invest in long format, in-depth narrative work. You have a calendar. You need a story to come. Like, I need a story to come in on Saturday, right? I can't go without one. But as long as I know on which Saturday I'm going to be able to publish that, I can give a writer all the time she needs to work on it. The shortest a story has ever taken from pitch to final draft at 52 has been 3 weeks. And that was when the writer pitched us a story that they had been working on already for they'd been thinking about it for months and years. They had all the research compiled. And so it was just a question of, do you like the idea? Yes. Can we work on rewrites with you in a way to make this accessible and appealing to a reader? Yes. That was all it took. The longest a story has taken has been a year and a half. And that's just because it was a tough subject and the reporter needed physical, needed time. They needed to do the physical work of going to locations and interviewing, and they needed emotional space to make sure that the story worked. And we were able to give them that. So if you can't do that, if you can't give a reporter time, then maybe you shouldn't be working on longish journalism.
Okay, I think we are nearly out of time. So thank you all to the audience for your questions. I also have many questions that I would like to ask, and so many things that I'd like to talk to you about, but we only have about an hour or so. But I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come and meet us online and spend time talking to us about the work that you do and the nuances of narrative journalism. You mentioned at one point that it's a creative process. So it's a very nice way of thinking about journalism. The fact that it could involve, it involves so many people. It also involves the readers. So thank you for doing the work that you do in making readers engaged, or kind of allowing readers to be engaged with certain topics or certain ideas of how journalism itself works. I think 52 is something that gets kind of passed down through every generation of St. Joseph's English department students. It's a very nice feeling to be able to speak to you after having read your work. After having read the products of your work and your work as well. So thank you so much for that careful effort.
Thank you, Yasmin, for being a great interviewer, and for all your questions. Thank you to everyone who listened and stuck around. Thank you for your kind words about 52. I will carry them back to our team and to our writers. It's been a pleasure and an honor, and I hope I can come back just so that I can listen to what you guys have been up to and ask you questions next time.
We're looking forward to that, Ms. Supriya. Vijay ma'am, I think we've wrapped up neatly.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Supriya. Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking me.
When you're next here in Bangalore, we could do this offline. That's the dream.
Yeah. It is now my dream as well. So I'll be in touch. Thank you, everyone. All the very best for the remaining days of the festival and for all your efforts going forward.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye for now.
Bye.